amazing how these threads from some of these organisations really make an impact and a difference for us. What's the most unexpected piece of advice you've ever been given that actually worked? Everyone talks about the bad advice you wish you never got, but what's something unexpected that really worked for you?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think probably the most important piece of advice is the idea that the moment you're nervous on the platform is because your focus is on you. Will they like me? Will I be thought of well? Will I get invited back? Will I get spin off? It's me. I'm like, wait. Is my focus, how am I adding value to them? How can this be useful to them? And the moment I shift that focus off me to the audience and how I'm adding value and helping, the nerves don't entirely disappear, but they become manageable. And the energy the nerves create becomes productive energy rather than crippling energy. And so I think that's probably the best advice I've gotten is nerves typically are a sign of misplaced emphasis.
So welcome back to the next conversation in the Speaker Driven Business podcast. And this is part of our guest series where we're talking to what I call our dream speakers and dream experts. And this week, the conversation is with none other than Michael McQueen. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be able to spend just some time chatting. It's nice, isn't it? We have all these micro moments at conferences, backstage or in networking things, but there's such short conversations. This is lovely. Great to be able to have a bit more time.
They are. And I think the podcast has been responsible for lots of relationships and conversations happening all around the world, which is fantastic. Michael, for our audience, I'd just love to ask you a very quick question to ask of everyone. Where in the world are you right now?
Good question. So I'm at home, which is
wow.
Always a thrill, always a joy at home. So home for me is Sydney. So on the north side of Sydney, a suburb called Lane Cove. Didn't grow up in Sydney, but it's been home for 22 years now. So it's home, but that's where I'm at right now.
Incredible. So you just mentioned it's been home for about 22 years.
So I've been here for probably 10. But yeah, before that, before we got the proper grown-up adult house, when we moved into kid stage, and my wife and I did the classic, when you're renting, you move around the place. And so we've lived in multiple areas in Sydney. So the inner west, we used to be in like this hub that was super Italian, which was brilliant. Like Friday night meals out, amazing pizza and pasta, and that sense of real community family vibe. Then where we are now is very much young families and very culturally diverse in different ways. So like what I love is that we're in a part of the city that like we I think 9 kilometers from downtown Sydney, but we're surrounded by trees. Like we've got a national park at the end of our street. We've got a golf course over the back fence. Like I do love that as someone who didn't grow up in the big city, having space and time to enjoy nature is a big part of what I love.
Yeah, it is. I love being able to get my feet in the grass.
Yes.
It's no matter where I am, if I can get my feet in the grass or I can look at the ocean, then I'm a happy girl.
Yeah, I agree. I'm with you.
Yeah. So, Michael, you're known as a futurist. In fact, you have recently been ranked number 12 futurist in the world. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What is it? We know you for that, but I'd love to know, what is it about your work? How would you describe yourself and how have you got there? So kind of the 5 to 7 minute snapshot insight into Michael McQueen.
Good question. So, and it is hard, isn't it? How do you condense a whole bunch of years? So for me, it's 21 years I've been on the conference speaking circuit, condensed it down to a few minutes. But I initially started off as a 22-year-old doing research specializing in the area of demographic trends and change. So where was the world heading in terms of especially generations? So at that point, it was Gen Y, Gen X, baby boomers, Gen Z or Gen Z were tiny. They were still young kids or in primary schools. At that stage, my main body of work and research was looking at where's the world heading from a generational standpoint. What I noticed early on is that it was one thing to do a lot of research, and I'd written essentially the manuscript of my first book. What I felt I was lacking was the on-the-ground experience. Now, in one sense, I was inherently credible because I was a Gen Y young person. I was 22, and I was in my first job out of university. I was seeing all of these dynamics playing out every day, but sample size of one isn't enough to obviously be an expert on anything. So what I realized was a gap and an opportunity was to go into schools, essentially to work with the young people themselves, to help 16, 17, 18-year-olds, all Gen Y or millennials, gear up for the future for them. And part of that future was going to be working for baby boomers and working for Gen Xers. And here's how they think. And here's how to get ahead in the workplace. So essentially what I was doing was going into high schools, running a program all around work readiness and future readiness. Did that for 3.5 years, worked with 80,000 young people, which was some of the hardest stuff I've ever done.
I was going to say, that's actually a really formidable storming ground, isn't it?
Super hard. I mean, the great thing is I was chatting with a colleague last week who's still mainly in schools, and I said, dude, what you don't know is the skills you are developing now are second to none. Like your apprenticeship working with 16 and 17-year-olds day after day, there's just nothing else like it. And then you go into work with corporates and adults and you're like, oh, people don't throw things at you. They're bored. Like they sit there and politely smile and think about what they're going to cook for dinner. Like it's such a different environment. So 3.5 years in schools with students. Then I wrote the first book based on what I'd seen in schools, 80,000 young people all around the world, what was happening in youth culture. That then shifted me into working with corporates and adults and parents and small business owners, basically anyone who's trying to get ready for the future generation coming through. And then I was off. So the last, however many years that was probably about 4 or 5 years in that I wrote and released that book. So over the last 15 or 16 years, I've written 9 other books that sort of have built on that with a broader and broader scope. And so rather than looking at demographic trends, looking at consumer sentiment changes and shifts in the notions of trust, and then looking at how do businesses maintain their edge when things are changing rapidly, and the whole theme of staying in that sweet spot, having momentum in rapidly changing times. The most recent sort of body of work for me has been to go from looking at the future and strategies to gear up for the future to look at the psychology of change.
And I've noticed that shift. So but I'm glad we're going there because I've noticed that and I love it. Can I just say?
Oh, it's encouraging. It's always a risk.
I'm your audience of one.
Sure, well, there you go. Sample size of one. But the problem with reinventing, and I've reinvented essentially 3 or 4 times over the last 21 years, and it's always this step into the unknown, because it's like an artist like Adele releases a cracking album. The pressure then is your better album, it needs to be different enough that it's distinct and interesting, but still you, and it's got to be super successful because everyone's writing on it. So for me, it's the same. 4 reinventions at every point. You're like, I feel like this is going to be relevant and helpful. This is running to head next content-wise, but you never really know. And it's worked in some ways better than I imagined, other ways different to what I'd imagined. But I would say 30 to 40% of my work now is around that theme. So essentially that book was all around the neuroscience of stubbornness. Why do people dig their heels in and not change? Even really smart, really thoughtful, really educated, intelligent people, why do we often have that reflex of resisting change? And for you individually, how do you not fall into that trap yourself? But if you're a leader and you're dealing with people in your team who are resistant to change, what works in shifting them, in getting them to be more open-minded and change their views? So that's been the most recent focus for me.
I really love that. And there's so many reasons why I love that. But what I'd love to know, first of all, the starting point, my first question, what prompted that shift to the psychology of it? And specifically around stubbornness, because I think most of us have been accused of being stubborn at some point of time.
Yes. I mean, it's always, it'd be nice to always say there was just like a moment where this was the next thing, and it was just like really clear line in the sand. It's never that. It's sort of, you get these inklings, this idea that I think there's something interesting there. I'd listen to an interview or read a piece of research about, for instance, conspiracy theorists. And how do you get through to them? I'm like, that's interesting. In fact, so much of what you would think would work backfires when you're trying to convince someone who's gone down the rabbit hole, for instance. And I'm like, so I'd read an article like that and think, oh, that's interesting. I wonder how that applies to leaders who I'm working with every day, who are dealing with different forms of rigid thinking, not conspiracy theory, but essentially the same thing in a different expression. So it was all those little things that started to, I guess, come together as an overarching theme. There was one conversation that I think crystallized the need for this as a topic, and that was a conversation with an audience member backstage during a book signing at an event in Sydney. It was a big industry association conference. I was the closing speaker, all around the future and disruption proofing your organization. And I remember this woman came up to me afterwards and she introduced herself. Her name was Helen, and she was the picture of exasperation. I can still picture her. She was so frustrated. And as I started chatting with her, I firstly wondered if she might have been one of those audience members that was there to like push back and argue with what you'd shared, which is fine. That happens sometimes. She wasn't. She was like fully on board. She said, I am so with you, like in terms of the disruptions, the trends you're talking about for our industry, how we've got to change. She said, I know in my organization, we've got probably 5 or 6 years before we're out of business. Like if we don't change, she said, my biggest challenge is I cannot get my leadership team to wake up. to realize that we need to change. They're so fixed, so rigid in their thinking. So she wanted some tips, some ideas. And I remember just feeling at a bit of a loss. I'm like, well, I don't know. I mean, I can tell you the things that sort of the conventional wisdom things, but she tried all those things and it hadn't worked. And so that was the trigger to go, I want to really dig deep here and get a sense of why that sort of that dynamic kicks off of resistance and stubbornness, but more importantly, what actually does work. And so that was really an 8 or 9 year process of research for this most recent book. I wrote 3 or 4 other books in the process while I was doing this bigger project. And so that'll probably define the next few years of my work as well now, is a lot of that sort of work.
One of the things that I just picked up on then was the conventional wisdom's not working. Now, you are a futurist, and I think when we look at the rate of change that is coming, not that is already with us, it's conventional wisdom is no longer going to work. What's your perspective on that? Because that's what I'm feeling.
Yes, I'm with you. So I think that there's always this tension where some of the things that have always worked will always work because humans are still human. And so I'm always aware of the power of that question of what's not going to change. What are the things that are timeless and true for humanity and for us as human beings? But at the same time, I think most of us, when we think about what shouldn't change, that's not where we're starting. When we think about what we don't want to change, we're essentially answering that question with what feels comfortable to us, what feels familiar, what feels safe. And that's an entirely different story. In fact, the encouragement I give to clients right now is in a time of rapid change, there's often this reflex for us as humans to want to cling to what we know, what feels predictable, what feels certain. But actually, that's the riskiest thing we can do. And so my encouragement to clients right now is rather than adopt a posture of certainty, that resolute certainty, we know how things should be because it's always worked and we've got experience and I've got runs on the board. Rather than certainty, what does curiosity look like? And curiosity by its very nature is open and humble and interested. It leans in, asks more questions and looking to race and give answers to complex things with simple explanations. So for leaders, that's tricky because we've often had this idea that the leader is the most certain, the most resolute. There's a difference between conviction and that sense of rigid certainty where you're unable to think, unable to open up and consider alternatives. And that's the challenge I'm seeing right now, is that's the conventional wisdom that it's always worked, so it always will work. That's the most dangerous thing. I mean, that old saying is true. The moment you think you've made it, you've passed it.
You've passed it, yeah.
And so for all of us, how do we not fall into that trap?
Yeah, really loving this. I could actually go on a really different tangent because
Sure.
part of my previous career was an industrial relations negotiator, which you would know is a mandate for change. It's usually a mechanism for complete corporate overhaul and change. So even just where you started with the generations, that was actually some of the things we had to work with all the time in negotiations, because one of the reasons I was at a point in time where baby boomers were in charge of the negotiations and didn't know how to negotiate with my generation and the next generation. And that's actually why I had this incredible opportunity, because I was literally teaching them how to negotiate to get the outcomes they wanted. So I could really go down that pathway. One of the things I wanted to think about and speak about now, though, was you mentioned then reinvention several times. You've been in the industry more than 20 years. We find a lot of people changing really fast, almost like with the winds. And you see that as an emerging speaker. They say they're testing things out, but it's rapid change. And I keep saying to people, you've got to land somewhere and be there for a bit and then move again. How do you normally know, if you've done several of these changes, you've done several of these books, what do you take into consideration with changing and evolving as a speaker?
Yeah. And the first thing is it needs to be, a couple of things. It needs to be congruent with who you are. If I haven't got experience or depth of wisdom in an area, just to go there because there's a market isn't the right move. But at the same time,
Can we repeat that?
But the opposite is also dangerously untrue, which is the idea of just leading with your passion and going, well, I'm passionate about this, so I'm going to lead with this as my topic. But is there a market for that? Like, you got to have these two things. Like, you got to have what's congruent for you and what's a felt need for your marketplace. And so you got to keep those two things in tension. If you're going to go with one or the other, I would start with the market. Start with the market, then backfill your credibility if you need to. For me, I mean, so much of it's just listening. I think the key to being a good speaker is getting really good at listening, for being a good listener. I mean, which just seems, again, counterintuitive, but it's so powerful. Like listening to lots of things, listening to what's being in the media. I would read 4, 5, 6 online news publications every day because I need to know what's happening. I need to get my eye in. It's almost like when you're buying a house and you live on realestate.com or Domain and Like when you're in that mode, you have got your eye in so closely and carefully, you recognize things that are out of the pattern. Well, that property's come up. That's cheaper than it really should be. Well, that's an opportunity. Like, I know that street. There's not been one on that street available for the last 4 years. Like, you know that stuff. When you're starting off, you don't know. You're like, they're all just seem like they're good houses. But once you got your eye in, you can now go beyond just identifying patterns to even gut feel. That feels like a good opportunity because I've spent so much time, I've got expertise. In terms of speaking and topics, it's the same. Like, listen very carefully to what's being said out there, because every now and again you'll then read an article and you think, oh, there's something in that. That's fresh. That's interesting. That's a piece of language that I haven't heard talked about before. I could probably position myself around that. I could even write a blog post or do a video post or maybe develop a keynote around that. And so you're listening to what the market's saying in terms of all of your customers, what are they reading? Where's the press focusing their emphasis at the moment? Also listen to what your customers are asking. I remember vividly, truly, it really is. So what your customers are asking for is valuable. Also what your customers are saying about you. Like if I can, I mean, it doesn't always happen, but if you can get a sense after you've done a keynote, what people have commented on about you. Like I had an event last Monday, and honestly, the amount of commentary from this audience over the last, in fact, there was a post that went live this morning reflecting their reflections on the conference, and our highlights were, and it was lovely. So many of them, I was one of their top 3 highlights, which is great because it was a 3-day conference, lots of speakers and really good speakers. I was the opening speaker, so there was probably that sense of I was an anchor moment because that was like set the tone for the whole thing. But what I noticed was what people said that I said. And I was like, oh, I did say that, but it was like an off-the-cuff thought. It was just like a snippet, a sentence. But I'm like, for them, that really stood out. And there are a couple of them that also the same thing was their like main message. And I'm like, that's cool because that wasn't what I thought was the point or the main message of that case study. That's what they took from it. So listening to your audience is helpful. The other thing in terms of getting your eye in with content and knowing where to really focus yourself reinvention-wise is the questions your market's asking. Like I had this event years ago for Westpac. I was in Adelaide. It was a roadshow. This was the South Australian date for the 6 or 7 day roadshow. It was all for small business owners. And so I did a keynote, I don't know, probably about the future and disruption and change and the rest. And so afterwards, there was this networking drinks thing, about 400 small businesses in the room. And so I stuck around, I was chatting with people and everyone was lovely and affirming and asking nice questions. But what I noticed is the number of questions that came up where the question had the word momentum in it. Like, I've got this small business and we've had a really good few years. I don't know how to keep this momentum going. Like, have you got any tips or ideas? Like that theme came up so often. And on the flight home the next morning, and it was one of these very early morning flights. I took off from Adelaide. Sun wasn't even up yet. As we're still climbing altitude, the sunrise is glorious morning. I'm looking out the window, the sun rising, just thinking about the night before, thinking about the event. And I'm like, the conscious thought was, gee, that word momentum came up so many times. Someone should write a book about that. That'd be a really good book. And I'm like, honestly, the next thought was,
that should be me.
I should write that book. But the thing is, I'd written a couple of books all around the future and disruption and strategy and how do you stay relevant.
So it actually makes sense.
Fast change. But suddenly when I looked at it through that lens, I almost took a step to the side and went, okay, what about momentum? The reality is any business that maintains longevity over the long haul, it's not just about identifying trends. It's also about developing that inner dynamism where you can stay in that flow state, stay in a groove and make sure a groove doesn't become a rut. And so that was the moment of that. So that was one of the reinventions, was literally that one thought. I had a similar one around the whole issue of trust years ago. The Banking Royal Commission had happened. I remember speaking at a conference in India, like a big ad agency conference. And I was so jet lagged. So I went back to the room at about 4 p.m. just to have a nap because I'm so tired. I've got to go to a thing tonight. And as I was drifting off to sleep, I'm like, this whole theme of trust, even all these ad agencies kept talking about trust as well, all the other speakers. And again, like literally, someone should write a book about what the modern challenge of building trust is all about. And literally, I'm like, I should write that book. Consumer sentiment trends and how do you build trust in an age of transparency and cynicism. And so these are these micro moments where if you're just listening to what other speakers are saying, what's in the press, what your audience is asking, you're getting data all the time. Those become your sort of the direction markers for you.
I really like this. One of the adages we use is momentum begets momentum. So what you're actually saying is, actually it's action. So what you're actually saying is you're actually in the arena, you're listening, you're opening your eyes up, you're reading, that the whispers are going to come.
Yeah. Yep. And it's just being alert to them. And again, just looking for the opportunities where others perhaps aren't. And I think that takes a type of humility in its own right.
So, Michael, you said before you wrote the first book after working with the kids for years, and we actually just mentioned last week in a program, maybe I should send all of them into schools to actually hone their craft. And everyone kind of went, yeah. And I thought, oh, they've got no idea what I just mentioned.
No idea. Yeah.
No idea. But you mentioned that you did that, then you wrote the book, and then really corporate took to it and it took off. Can you tell me about transitioning from being someone working with kids into being that professional speaker, the speaking-led business that became Michael McQueen? Because that is quite a jump, even though it sounds amazing.
Yeah, it is a jump. It's a jump in lots of ways. It's a shift in fees. But in terms of knowing where to price yourself, and for a while I had dual pricing. I had like an education rate and then a corporate rate. Over time, I've sort of harmonized that, and so I've just got one keynote fee, and that's changed over time. But yeah, there were a number of things that needed to shift. What I found, and the thing was, I guess, somewhat unique for me, is I went from being in schools where being 22, 23, 24 was useful because I was just old enough to be sort of credible, but young enough to still be cool. I mean, I wasn't cool. I was never cool, which was fine.
Were you studying economics or research or something?
Yeah, like really. But even as a teenager, I was never your classic teenager. Even when I started going back into schools, I'm like, I'm not cut out for this. Because even when I was 16, I wasn't a normal 16-year-old. I was like, I was anxious to get on with life and start a business. I was like the SRC nerdy dude. So I'm like, so I'd go into schools. I was never cool, but at least I was young enough to be relevant and relatable. I then start going to corporate world, and I am the youngest person at the table in the room by far. Like, I'd be going into corporates, and like I'm the age of their kids. And so fortunately, having no hair was useful in that sense that I always looked a little bit older because of that. But it also meant that I had to be mindful of like what I wore to have the credibility to stand in those spaces. So I was wearing suits, and I always tried to look professional without looking too like used car salesman. You got to strike that balance. But being professional really helped. Something about my pace shifted. I slowed down. I held my space. There was no sense of I've got to like try and be cool. I've got to be liked. It was like, in fact, I remember speaking with someone years ago. I was still probably only 26 or 27, and his reflection, it was lovely feedback. He said, you've got a gravitas about you which doesn't make a lot of sense for your age. How do you do that? And I'm like, I don't know. I wasn't conscious, but what I'd had unconsciously done was just slow down deliberately, purposefully. My gesturing changed. My gesturing was direct. It wasn't like rah-rah. It was firm. It was authoritative. It was open, it was humble, it was a bit playful at times. So I never took myself too seriously, because you can't when you're young. I just think if you take yourself too seriously, you look needy, or you would see people are trying to be credible and they become brash. I'm like, that's not helpful. But also I didn't want to be too needy, because if you've got posturing, like you can't see in the screen, but like open hands like this and trying to, please like me, please think I'm okay. Like that's not useful either. So
it's like an accidental apology. Like, I'm not sure that I should take up your space. Can you please? And that's what I said, especially for women. Like, it actually ends up the direct opposite of that.
That's so tricky for women. Much harder for women than men. I mean, this is one of the things I noticed from a speaking standpoint. Men have got a broader palette to paint from. Women have a very narrow palette, and it's inherently infuriatingly unfair for women.
Yeah.
Because if you're too strong, you're too tough. And if you're too warm, you're too weak. Whereas men, if you're weak, you're relatable and kind. If you're tough, you're decisive. I mean, it's just stupid, but that is a reality. So, but I did find, even as a young person, I also had a fairly narrow palette to compare from in terms of my position.
Because you were young into corporate? Is that why you would think that was?
I was just young in the room. I mean, the beauty was, at least I was speaking about youth issues. So at least I could be there almost like, I'm an ambassador from the other side. I've come from the land of young people to tell you how it is. But that sort of worked. But there really was very deliberately, and honestly, sometimes a conscious choice to stand up there and tell myself, I have the right to be here. I've got something valuable to add here. And just even shifting that mentality makes the world of difference. Now, that's easy to say, hard to do. People talk about imposter syndrome. I've never really had imposter syndrome, and I don't think it's because I'm particularly egotistical. I don't think I am, but I'm pretty certain of who I am and what I can offer. I have a degree of confidence and always ballast, ballast in a ship that gives you strength and means you stay upright. I think I've got that for whatever reason, but I've never really wrestled with that sense of imposter syndrome. But for a lot of speakers, it's a real challenge, because the moment people sniff it, it changes the whole dynamic. So for me, that shift into corporate was a lot about how to own my space. I had some great coaching from a movement lecturer that my wife had been taught by at university. My wife's an actor, so in her acting degree, one of her movement lecturers she'd stayed in contact with. So I reached out to her, got a couple of sessions, just training in terms of body use and voice use. And she gave me this beautiful metaphor for owning your space. She said, okay, before you step onto the platform, I want you to imagine you're wearing a robe, but it's like, no, it's not just like a bathrobe, like it's a long flowing, almost like a regal king or queen type robe. And maybe even picture the color, like it's a deep red sort of color, and it's heavy, it's got heft, and it's flat. When it hangs, it drips off you and it goes on the ground, but then it goes out. It takes up the space 2 or 3 meters around you. And as you walk, this robe wafts around you, and you walk up and it follows your space, but there's an ease, there's a flow, there's a gravity about your presence. And it sounds silly, but honestly, the difference that made of like literally imagining yourself walking on platform, this is probably what slowed me down actually as well. Like imagining I'm walking on.
Thinking that I can feel
it. Yep,
yeah,
there you
can
go.
feel it, and it's that movement, and it's that and that slow down, and understanding as well that you're filling space.
Filling space, and it's yours to fill.
Yeah,
you're not taking
I
it
love
from someone else. Like so all these little things, that transition, these were all parts of what made it work for me.
Yeah, amazing. Michael, we were all, I remember being, and I am going to raise 2020, we were all in the room for platform professionals, and you'd come back from Asia and you walked in the room that morning and you said, before your session, and you said, guys, we need to have a conversation about what's happening around the world. And we were all kind of, yeah, okay. And then you had a conversation with us. And then the next time I saw you, your phone was blowing up for all the wrong reasons.
Correct.
And that was literally a meltdown for almost everybody there.
Yep.
That was quite a storm. I'd love to ask how you actually navigated that on a personal level. And then I've got a follow-up question to that, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So it was a storm, and everyone went into that storm in different ways. So as a family, we went into that storm pre-vulnerable. And the vulnerability for us is we had, in the previous 12 months, done a renovation on our house, like pretty much gutting and rebuilding. And I mean, I always try to be mindful of using language that escalates. I don't want to call things a disaster or a nightmare, but it was those things to me anyway. Like it went way over budget, almost bankrupted us as a family. We just moved back in pre that Adelaide convention, and I'm like, we're going to spend the next 12 to 18 months just paying off the final debts. Like we'd borrowed money off my mum to be able to finish the job. I was very hurt, very betrayed, but had a family member running the project. And I just felt like that a lot of what had gone wrong was gone wrong because it wasn't well managed. So there was all this, like emotions like bitterness and resentment were unfamiliar to me. I don't do bitterness a lot. I was so bitter about this. I'm like, this bloody house, honestly. And so it was so front of mind, but I'm like, it's okay, we'll get back in. And I'll just have to work my backside off and rebuild and get back in. So then to lose everything, like it was just, I just remember that sense of we are so far behind. We're in a house we couldn't afford anyway because of how much of a disaster the project had been. And we'd had no control over that. Like we're very disciplined, diligent, have money in the bank, savings type people. So it was just so unfamiliar for us, not through our own fault. And now my entire business disappeared. So it was very stressful. But the emotions for me, what I noticed was the bitterness and resentment were present in a way that was unfamiliar to me, but also I went into victim mode. It's not fair, which again, I was really surprised at. And I've read all the books about positive mental attitudes and choosing your confession. I didn't have the tools I needed to do well. And it was really interesting. So that first few weeks, that was incredibly hard. Interestingly, after the storm, it was the lack of a storm that was even harder. I remember describing at one of the PSA conventions, reflecting on COVID, about the doldrums. And I don't know if you were at that session or not, but we hear the term, do you know what the doldrums are as a nautical term? Okay. I didn't know, a lot of people don't know, but like the doldrums are this ring around the equator where there's no wind. And once you enter the doldrums, you can spend weeks or months just hanging out there waiting. And see, after the storm, then there were the doldrums where like no one was booking anything. There was nothing much happening. Like at least at first you could pivot and reinvent. And for 2021, people were over virtuals. They didn't want to do any more virtual. Like, so I just found the doldrums were harder in a different way where literally I had to just sit back and go, the speakers getting work right now are the mental health speakers, the resilience speakers, the corporate culture, working from home people. No one wants to hear about the future right now. The future is terrifying and so uncertain. So I just literally stood back and went, this is not my season to lean in and press in and contribute here. So I spent a few months just waiting. And so that's what the doldrums are like. So it was storm and then lack of storm, each in different ways were quite tricky.
So what have you, because all of us have come out in very different ways, and thinking about that impact, and that's what I noticed in that room. I mean, on one hand, being together for that national convention was amazing because we were all there together. On the other hand, it was like, it almost like was fueling the fire because everybody's phones were blowing up and everyone's lives were blowing apart. But going from the storms to the not storm, as you said, and then now the other side of it. So, for example, right now, my life is so crazy full, but I find myself grateful because I don't ever want to be not busy again, right? And not in an unhealthy way, just in a post-shutdown way, lockdown way. What have you really taken with you into what you do and don't do now from a professional experience and on a personal level?
Yeah. So firstly, one of the things I've noticed within myself is when I have those moments of walking through a busy airport terminal and flights delayed, and I just recall what it was like to drive past the airport and there were 5 departing flights from Sydney that day, the whole day. And the airport was empty. It was like zombie apocalypse vibes. And I remember consciously saying, I'll never be frustrated with a busy airport security queue again. I'll never be. And I honestly, and I haven't. I just genuinely go, even when it's busy and crazy, I'm like, but isn't it great? We're all out. We're traveling. People are doing, life is happening. People are seeing family or friends. So I think that's certainly a big part of what I took from it. I think, and before we went on air, we were talking about how, like, even before we started recording, or the microphone didn't work and an update messed up. And we did get very good at this, but I certainly also learned that as much as this is such a blessing and a gift to be able to do virtual things, I just love people. I love audiences. I love being in person. I knew some speakers who were like, I'm just loving not traveling and I'm loving being able to deliver from home. I just want to stay doing this after it's over. I'm like, have fun with that. But I agree. I'm like, I'm out as soon as we can on a plane with people. So I certainly learned that about myself, is that sense of valuing, cherishing the things that otherwise can sometimes get a bit long in the tooth and a bit frustrating. I mean, professionally, I also used the time to do a lot of the work on the most recent book. I remember early on reading how many great thinkers in history had used various bouts of the plague in Europe when there were essentially lockdowns to write. You know, Shakespeare wrote at least 2 plays. I think Hamlet was in fact the result of essentially a lockdown during the plague. And so I'm thinking, okay, so if we're going to have to lock down, how do I use this time fruitfully? I didn't make sourdough. I didn't, do all the things that people did. I started writing and I started researching, and I just thought, if I've got time, how do I use this time well? So I'm glad when I look back that I was able to do that.
Were there any, when we look back, we're all glad, aren't we? We're a little bit bumpy on the way through. The doldrums were a little bit rough on the way out. When it comes to storms, though, was that the only storm that you've experienced? Because you even just said, I remember being in travel. So my previous husband and I were travel wholesalers when 9/11 hit. So that was obviously travel shut down, but events did as well. A lot of people don't realize events did, especially in the US. So what other storms have you been through in your career? Is there anything that stands out? Like the pandemic's the most recent and was very big. Was there anything else you had to navigate on the way through with this decades-long career?
Nothing as significant as that. Certainly there've been like different storms along the way, particularly when, like, I remember doing this interview, and it was actually during the beginning of COVID. It was like, I think March 28th or something. I was doing this webinar, and literally before I stepped into the studio, which is the space I'm in right now, we got a call from my mother-in-law. She just said, look, I've just come back from the doctor. They've done a biopsy on a lump, and so firstly, we found out that it's melanoma, but also they were looking at something else while they were there, and they found that I've got essentially a tennis ball sized tumor on one of my kidneys. You'd have to take the kidney out. It's unrelated, but they found both at the same time. So like the world's falling apart, and I've got to literally come into the studio and like try and deliver down the barrel of a camera. And that's the next 4 months of just absolute chaos in our lives. So like, again, we're in the house we can't afford. We've got no money. All the work's dried up except for a few random things that all went online. But then it was just not high revenue, but it was at least keeping something happening. And then behind the scenes, all that going on. So I do remember that in all the ways was a very, very tricky time. The other big one for me was the very start of my career. So I shared this story recently with a group of speakers, but I haven't talked about it super openly, not for any reason, it just hasn't come up. But so when I had first written the manuscript for that book on generational change, I had given the book to my dad to read. My dad was a careers advisor in high school. So his whole job was to help essentially students get ready for the future. He read the book around generational differences in the workplace. He said, this would be really valuable to go into schools. He said, we get funding as careers advisors to run school to work transition programs with our students in year 10, 11 and 12. He said, if you could tweak the language and make it fit the funding requirements, you could like develop a business just going into schools and running these sorts of sessions. So that was the genesis moment of that. That was a conversation. He sent an email introduction to the head of the Careers Advisors Association. Her name was Lynn Camp, and Lynn was an absolute gem. And the reason it was so significant is so Dad had said this is a Sunday. On the Monday at 2:30 in the afternoon, no, it wasn't at 2:30, I found out at 2:30, about 11:30 in the morning, my dad was on the back veranda at our house, 51, fit, healthy, we thought, had an underlying heart condition that was undiagnosed, and just heart stopped working. That was it. It was gone. It was just like, so coming out of that, all I had, so after the funeral and all the stuff, dust sort of settles, you sort of try and figure out, well, what does life look like? All of us in my family in different ways trying to figure out what does this mean for us? And I came back to Sydney, moved back up here after all the things. And then I had this email in my inbox from him. Like the last email I got from him was introducing me to Lynn. And so I remember sitting on it thinking, oh, I know he said I could probably start a business around this. That'd be really cool, but I don't know. I don't know how to do that. And so I thought, well, all I've got is this, like this one thin thread, this one link. And so I emailed Lynn and said, look, I know that Dad made this intro a week or so back. I'd love to just maybe pick up on that and get some advice about how this could work. And I think Lynn, who'd known my dad for years professionally, felt sad for me, a bit of pity. She said, oh, come out to my house. She lives in Ingleburn, so out in southwest Sydney. Come in, well, I'll make you a cup of coffee. We'll sit down and we'll develop a plan. I'll help you get started. And she said, we've got a mail out that goes out to all the careers advisors in the state. Normally we charge an amount of money for advertisers to include brochures in those mail outs. She said, oh, just don't tell anyone. I'll just put a brochure in for you. If you want to launch this, we're doing a mail out late next week. If you can get a brochure designed and whipped up and then deliver them to me, we'll put it in for free. And that was the beginning. So it was, in terms of a storm.
That is almost bittersweet.
It really was. It really, really was. I remember replying to Dad's email thinking I owe it to him. I mean, he's made this intro. The least I can do is follow it up. But yeah, it was huge. So that was certainly a very different type of storm. But my whole speaking career essentially started out of a storm like that as well.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm not often stuck for words, as you probably already know, but that's so bittersweet. I can imagine how that really would have felt. Is there anything that along the way, so we talked about the storms, what's been the moment where you go, wow, I'm really here?
Actually, I do remember that, a very specific moment. And it happened 2012. I remember it because I've got this little phone charge, those global international phone charging things. And it came from the conference and it's got the year of the conference on the side of the little phone charger. So I know where the event was and when. It was 2012. And so I'd done a 7-city roadshow with Fuji Xerox, and it was around China, Korea. We went to Hong Kong. We'd been to Singapore. We finished in Taipei in Taiwan. And I just remember going back to the airport from Taipei, sitting in the back of a car, like a driver type limo service thing. And at that point I was, how many years in? I guess I was 8 years in type thing. So I was feeling like, okay, this has become a thing now. But I do remember as I drove back to the airport in a completely foreign country, thinking, I feel like I might have made it. I feel like this is the dream. And I remember vividly thinking that. And well, the second thought was, but obviously there's more. I'm not going to get complacent and rest on my laurels here, but like just that sense of genuine satisfaction and joy at like this thing I set out to do has happened. Like there are so few people that get the chance to do what I just did, a 7-city or 7-country roadshow, and I got paid a ludicrous amount of money for it and had such a blast, met some awesome people. I'm like, this is the dream. So I do vividly remember that one.
Did you know that you would go international? Was that always part of the dream, or did that evolve as you got started? Like, did you always have this sense in your heart that this was bigger than you?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, I did. So my entry into speaking started when I was very young. So as in my interest in going into speaking. So I was only 8 when I first saw a speaker at a conference I grew up in an Amway household. So like my parents went to an Amway conference when they just joined, the business was getting started, and the babysitter fell through or something. So my brothers and I, 5 of us, 5 boys, all got dragged along to sit at
That's a whole different conversation.
Whole different conversation. And so we were sitting at the back of Festival Hall in Melbourne, and there's a woman on the stage named Florence Littauer, who years ago wrote a book called Personality Plus. You know of her, yeah. So like, just seeming like beautiful soul by all reports. People who know her said she was absolutely lovely. So, but as an 8-year-old, I watched her on stage, and she just held this room of 3,500 people for an hour, and like, again, could have heard a pin drop type vibes. And I remember just as a kid just going, that's what I want to do. I remember saying that to my parents afterwards, And they, the polite thing, like when your kid wants to be an astronaut or a firefighter, like, oh, that sounds nice. So I wanted to be a public speaker. And I said, oh, that's nice. But like, it really stuck with me the entire way through school. It was on the radar that I met a few people late high school into university years who were doing it. Just bumped into people like Lisa McGinnis-Smith, who we both mutually adore. And just met people who did this, and their advice was join PSA, the Speakers Association, find your niche and then become an expert in that. So in a way, that was, it's been on my radar for a long time. And I guess even from that young age, I'm like, if I'm going to do this, almost that sense of calling, I guess it probably will be big. I don't want to just do average.
Well, at 8 years old, also, you don't have any qualifiers around it, do you?
Correct.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
My first career choice was going to be, before everything went a little bit different with my life pathway, but it was, I knew when I was very young that, and I grew up in central Queensland, very remote central Queensland. And yet I had a dream that I was going to study law, go to Harvard to get my master's, go and work for the York District Attorney's Office, work my way up, become a top prosecutor, maybe one day come home when I had children. But I knew that as a little kid growing up in, like, our town had 2,000 people in it.
What?
So I don't know. By the time I went away to boarding school, and it got fueled there because my legal studies teacher was actually a barrister. So that was formidable, but I'm not really sure. My mother was very big into community advocacy and she did a lot of work. So there's a lot of firsts that come under her belt. And so an extension of that, maybe. I mean, but we had one solicitor who really wrote wills in the town. Like, like there wasn't anything really going down. So yeah, so that, I think that sense of, if it's something you had from such a young age, you don't qualify it, do you? It's like, I'm going to be that. And I love that Amway story. I shared this with Lisa as well on the podcast. My first experience of a motivational speaker was an Amway conference when I was 21. Yeah. And it was Janine Shepherd, who you would know. And I'd never understood that your story didn't have to define you. And she definitely showed me that that was possible. And it was also the first time I bought a book from the back of the room. And I ran, not because I was hyped up, but because I didn't understand that there would be enough books for everyone there, right? So and I still have it on my bookshelves, right? And so that was my first introduction. And that was one of the things that really set in my mind because of the shift that she created that day that started me getting my life back on track. Right. So, yeah, so it's amazing how these threads from some of these organizations really make an impact and a difference for us. What's the most unexpected piece of advice you've ever been given that actually worked? Everyone talks about the bad advice you wish you never got, but what's something unexpected that really worked for you?
Oh, that's such a good question. I'd love to give that some thought. A piece of advice that's just really worked. I think probably the most important piece of advice is the idea that the moment you're nervous on the platform is because your focus is on you. And I just
I'm so glad to hear you say that you still have that.
Yeah, well, truly. And so, but I know the moment I'm there, I'm like, it's that checklist. Will I remember it? Will they like me? Will I be thought of well? Will I get invited back? Will I get spin off? It's me. I'm like, wait. Is my focus? How am I adding value to them? Is this going to be, how can this be useful to them? And the moment I shift that focus off me to the audience and how I'm adding value and helping, the nerves don't entirely disappear, but they become manageable. And the energy the nerves create becomes productive energy rather than crippling energy. And so I think that's probably the best advice I've gotten is nerves typically are a sign of misplaced emphasis.
I love that so much because I get very nervous. I actually try to cancel my own gigs on the day and also, so I have a team around me, including Martin, my husband, who knows and my EA who won't let me do that stuff. And it's from coming from as an introvert and also from a big trauma background. So like being visible is a big thing. But actually the way that I change those nerves every time is I remind myself it's about them.
Yeah, great. Yep.
That's exactly, so for different reasons, but that's exactly how I overcome my nerves. So I really love that. Our audience on the podcast is predominantly emerging and aspiring speakers or speakers who haven't got the breakthrough they wanted. We're going to have to wrap this conversation up very soon. I could talk to you all day. But for those people that are listening right now who are emerging, are aspiring, I feel like I always think it's like figurative, like they're getting their claws into the stage and they just boost themselves over the edge. What's your biggest piece of advice that you would love them to take away with them?
I think my biggest encouragement would be there are lots of paths up the mountain. Like one of the frustrations I have when I get around a lot of speakers is you hear a very prescriptive view of this is the way you should do it. Even at PSA, there's this sense of like, this is the way you build a speaking business. This is the way you command a stage. In fact, what's interesting is often when I'm at PSA events, I'm like, what we're all told is the key to like owning the stage. I'm like, I don't do any of that.
No, either do I. And either do my best clients.
Truly, honestly, like I sit there and think, I might be the only one here, but honestly, I don't do that.
Do it.
I stand on the platform and I have a conversation. It's an elevated version of me, but I'm just me.
Yeah.
And I put my hand in my pocket and I just chat. And like you told, you shouldn't put your hand in your pocket. I do. People seem to love it because it's congruent. It's who I am. It's just like what I am on stage is very, very similar to like what I'm like right now. This is just it. This is just what I do. And so what I would just say is there's lots of paths at the mountain, lots of ways you can structure a business financially, lots of ways you can win on stage. Be super careful of the comparison trap of thinking you've got to be like, or, someone else, model them, mimic them, be inspired by, but don't imitate. Like it doesn't work for you. And for me, I spent years and years in speaker land in complete obscurity, just out doing my thing. No one
knew the reps.
Yeah, get the reps. Doing the reps. And two phrases that kept front of mind that encouraged me to stick at it was, if it was easy, everyone would do it. It's not easy. If it was, everyone would do this, and it's not. It's a very hard thing to have success in speaking, just like it's hard to be excellent in any profession. So if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. And the other one too is this whole notion that public victories are always preceded by thousands of private ones. It's those moments that no one's applauding, no one sees the effort you're putting in. Like I do so much obscure work, like stuff that no one sees. Like it's talking to the wall in my study for hours, honing content, transitions, ideas, language. Like it's, when I get on stage and it's just a conversation, it looks very effortless. There is so much that goes on behind the scenes to make it look effortless. And so just in those moments where you feel like I'm doing the stuff, but no one's applauding or even knows who I am, firstly, you're walking your own path at the mountain. Just have confidence in that. Listen to others, but don't be obsessed with all the advice you get. And then also realize you're just doing it's the private victories. The public ones will come if you just keep diligently doing the right things with excellence.
I love that. One of your colleagues in the futurist space, John Senai, closed Influence in the US last year. And he had this slide up that I actually sent to every one of my clients. And it said, the lights on the stage simply reveal the work in the dark.
Oh, I love that. That's great. Yeah, good.
So I'm like, I know that John and you are in the same space, but it has
great.
Yeah, it has stuck with me throughout time. And what you just said as well, I'm just going to back that up with find your own way. I have an interesting relationship as I put a lot of people in the rooms at PSA at their different events and things like that, especially as emerging speakers. But I hold my breath because I don't want them to bump into, you must do it this way. I've had people walk into, when I used to run 3-day workshops, I've had people walk in, and on day 2, one particular woman who was an emerging speaker walked in on day 2 and threw like $1,000 worth of books over the boardroom table and said, anyone can take them. I'm like, what is this? And she said, it's all the books that I've bought trying to become a leadership speaker because I was told I couldn't make money unless I was a leadership speaker in corporate. She's a children's mental health advocate and she's brilliant. But every single person she bumped into was, you can only make money this way and you must do this. And so she had literally turned herself into a pretzel for 2 years trying to figure out how she could change into a leadership speaker. And so the way that you said that is just perfect. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for that because it's so important. And Michael, we're going to have to wrap up the conversation for the podcast there. I have really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for your time. Can't wait till we do it again.
Look forward to it. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you.